So the last thing we need to learn about before we build our newsreader app is how to display web content within our apps. And we do that using something called a web view, which does exactly what you might expect and allows us to display websites and other HTML-based content right there within our apps. So here we go. I'm going to start by creating our web view in the usual way in our layout. So I'm going to scroll down and find under containers, web view. So let's get rid of the text view. Drag in our web view and we'll make it full width and height. I'll give it an ID of web view and that's all the setup that we need. So I'll just run it so that we can run it quickly later on. And then we set up our web view in the onCreate method. So we'll begin by finding it in the usual way by its ID. So we'll create a web view variable called web view and we'll find it by its ID. resources.id.webview. And we'll need to cast that to a web view as well. Oh, and I think I need to capitalize that V. And we'll capitalize that one as well, just to keep everything up to scratch. And there's a couple of settings that we need to customize here. And the first one that I'd recommend doing pretty much every time is using WebView get settings. And then you can see there's a whole range of settings depending on what you're going to be doing with your web view that you might want to adjust. But the one that I'd always choose, unless you specifically don't need it, is set JavaScript enabled. And I would set that to true, simply because JavaScript is so widely used on the web. If you don't do this, it's likely that any websites that you display won't display properly. Of course, if you're doing something particularly security conscious or you want to particularly control what the user is doing, then you might not want to do that. But in the general case where you just want to display websites like in our newsreader app, then I would turn JavaScript on. And the other setting that we'll add is set web view client. And we'll set this as a new web view client. And this is because on a number of phones, if you don't do this, then instead of actually displaying it in your web view, it will jump to the device's default browser and display the website there instead, which is almost certainly not what you want if you're creating a web view. All right, so then we just need to load a URL, and that can be any URL you want. So let's go for www.google.com. And that will then load the URL into that web view. We're not quite done yet though, because we need to ask for a permission here. And that permission is the internet permission. So android.permission.internet. Obviously without that, we're not going to be able to display very much of interest. Okay, so that's all there is to it. We've added our web view. We've set JavaScript enabled. We've set it as the web view client and we've loaded a URL in it. So then let's have a look. And there we go. So there's our web view with the Google website displayed in it, and we can obviously interact with that in the usual way. One other thing to show you is that as well as loading external URLs, you can also load HTML content using load data. So if you know any HTML, you should be able to come up with a basic HTML web page. It might look something like this. So we define a bit of HTML in an HTML tag. Then we're going to define the body of the page. we can do a simple h1 header, which will say hi there, close the header, then start a paragraph saying this is my website, close the paragraph, close the body, and then end our HTML page. We then need to add a couple of extra variables. The first is the type of data that we're loading here. Now this is HTML data, so we use text/HTML, and then we enter the character encoding that we're using, and we're going to use just the default character encoding, which is UTF-8. There we go. So this can be useful in several situations, especially if you are a web developer and you want to display a certain amount of web content to the user, then you might want to load data like this. It's worth noting as well that you can build complete apps in this way using the web view as the basis for the whole app, and then the app itself is written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I talk about how to do that in my complete web developer course, but we're not going to go into that now. We don't need it because we can build apps natively. And there we go. So there's our HTML content, which could display anything we like. All right, so that's all we need to know about web views. Of course, they are going to be what we will use to display our news content to our users in the newsreader app that we're going to build in the next video.